have to have two really wonderful OLOC members and authors give our presentation. Nancy Manahan and Becky Bohan have been together for 27 years. They live in Minneapolis, and they also spend their winters in Florida at Carefree Resort. Everybody is familiar with as a lesbian resort near Fort Myers, Florida. Nancy's a retired college English teacher whose books include Lesbian Nuns. I'm sure many of us have read it, Breaking Silence, and On My Honor, Lesbians Reflect on Their Scouting Experience. I'm quite sure we have a few Girl Scouts in the audience today. That's great. Becky is a retired small business owner whose latest novel, A Light on Altered Land, explores ageism, medicinal cannabis, and the erasure of lesbian culture, subjects that are really dear to all of us. They have traveled, she has other books. The Centering is Set Up, a novel of suspense and romance, will be published later this year. They've traveled a lot, and they have co-authored the award-winning Living Consciously, Dying Gracefully, A Journey with Cancer and Beyond. They've traveled widely, leaving Minnesota for Carefree, and they obviously work together really, really well. They are also co-founders of an organization, was it 7 or 8 years ago? And I'm sure you'd like to talk about that, Nancy and Becky. So you're tired of listening to me? Go right ahead.
Thank you, Ruth and OLOC, for having us. I'm going to be reading from my book, A Light on Altered Land. It's the story of two women in their 60s, both retired. One is retired, Ellie is a retired college teacher, and Catherine is a retired psychotherapist. Ellie lost her wife of many years, a few years earlier. And these two characters are out to lunch, and Catherine asks Ellie about how Mary died. So I'm going to pick it up from there. Aggressive breast cancer. She did everything the medical industrial complex could torture her with: double mastectomy, chemo, radiation. She went through hell, as did you. I witnessed hell. Mary lived it, and with amazingly good spirits. She was determined to live until she died, only she died sooner than we expected. Her immune system was wrecked, so when she got pneumonia, she couldn't stay ahead of it. Were you with her at the end? Yes and no. Ellie shook her head, tears threatening to form. After all the days and nights I had been tending to her, I wasn't with her the moment she died. What happened? It was a late morning in February, and Mary wanted some lemon sorbet. She'd get these cravings, and she was down to skin and bones by that time, so I would have gone to the North Pole to get it. Anyway, I wanted some fresh air, so I walked to the grocery store, leaving her alone for maybe 30 minutes max. She didn't seem to be near death at all, but when I got home, she was gone. Just like that, it was all over. I didn't get to be with her as she passed, but she did die at home as she wanted. I'm sorry, that must have been difficult. It was. Ellie took a deep breath, grateful Catherine had not said, as so many had, that maybe Mary needed her to be gone so she could die. I felt her loving presence in the room for several hours. It was weird and wonderful. I experienced a sort of transcendent sense of eternity. The light in Catherine's eyes shifted as she nodded softly. We had arranged for a 3-day home vigil. So after I recovered from the initial shock, I called my support team, and everyone jumped into action. It was awesome, Catherine. We had her body on dry ice in the living room. People came at all hours to sit and sing and talk. There were lots of stories and tears and laughter. It was just the way she wanted it to be. You two must have done a lot of planning to make it happen according to your wishes. It was mostly Mary. She did tons of research and consulted with a local end-of-life group. She was very definite. She knew how things can get screwed up in the endgame chaos. So she had 3 pages of instructions, including contact numbers. Both women laughed softly. Was it legal to keep her body at home for so long? Totally. She was in hospice, so there was no problem with getting the death certificate signed. And it's legal in Minnesota to have an unbound body at home with certain restrictions, of course. What happened after 3 days? Well, after 3 days, the reality of her death was palpable. You just knew that her spirit was gone and her body was just the garment she wore in this lifetime. Everyone was ready to let her go. A friend had a van and we transported her body to a green cemetery, the only one in the state at the time, and laid her in the ground, wrapped in a shroud. Ellie smiled. Actually, it was a beautiful linen tablecloth from her grandmother. A shroud, not a casket? No, Mary wanted the earth to hold her body and give its nutrients back to support life. The waitress comes, delivers their food, and they eat a little bit, and then they continue. Catherine says, how was it for you taking care of Mary? It was a privilege, Ellie said, and a challenge. I feel guilty that I wasn't a better caregiver. Catherine wore a neutral expression. I got impatient sometimes. I got tired of her being sick and having to clean up and of the swirl of doctor's appointments, the cascade of bad news, the sleepless nights. But I also felt it was the greatest honor in the world to look after such a precious soul. Catherine smiled kindly. I think most caregivers feel the same way, Ellie. It's hard to be up day after day. Impossible, I'd say. I suspect Mary felt she was lucky to have you. She told me so repeatedly, Ellie said, but I always felt I could be doing more. It wasn't within your power to take the disease away. No, it wasn't. And that's what we all want with our loved ones, just to take the hurt away. To put everything back to normal, to the way it was. Ellie looked out the window to the bare trees in the enclosed courtyard. You don't really think how things will change when you're young and in love and have your whole lives ahead of you. But a chronic or terminal disease really changes a relationship. I'm sure you've heard plenty of stories in your practice, but it's shocking when it happens, when an independent person goes into decline and becomes dependent. I saw it happen with my parents, and I admired my dad taking care of my mom when she became cognitively impaired. He always showed great patience. You may be idealizing, Ellie. You can bet your dad had flashes of anger and resentment. No one is an angel, even Mother Teresa. I suppose. Ellie was caught by Catherine's gaze as though it were a laser demanding truth. Sometimes I felt my life wasn't my own. Everything had to be on Mary's terms, really on the cancer's terms. We'd watch movies and play music Mary felt she could enjoy. I played cribbage with her until I thought I could never bear another game. A memory pulled at Ellie's mouth. In fact, I laid the board in her grave thinking she would enjoy it more than I ever would again. But now I miss it, or perhaps I just miss playing with her. Catherine nodded. I'm not a codependent person by nature, Catherine, but I felt at times I had become one. It was a compassionate thing to do, the right thing, but I lost a bit of myself. I just wish I could have been better with both Mary and myself. It gets complicated. Life endings are really challenging, partly because you never know how they'll unfold. People do the best they can, Ellie. You have to believe that of yourself and let it go. Do you feel you've retrieved that lost bit? Yes. Her death allowed me to breathe again, painfully at first, but freely now. I eventually stepped back into the cycle of life. I know how precious life and health are, and really how little time we have to walk this earth. So that's the selection. If you want to take a moment to reflect on this and write any questions or comments in the chat, please do so at this time. Thanks. Okay, yes.
Well, Becky, where did you get the idea for that scene?
Oh, well, actually, that scene came from our experience with Diane Manahan. That was the wife of Nancy's brother, Bill. She developed cancer when she was 55. It went into remission, but then it came back with a roar. And she had an extraordinary end of life journey. And we recorded that in our book. And Nancy's going to read a passage from that now.
Okay. Yes, Living Consciously, Dying Gracefully, A Journey with Cancer and Beyond is partly the story of good communication. Diane, my sister-in-law, was a professor of nursing, and when she was diagnosed, although she was a very private person, she decided to be completely open about her cancer journey with family, with friends, and even with her nursing students at Mankato State University in Minnesota. She thought, well, if I can't talk to nursing students about this and maybe be a role model for communicating openly about the big C, which 20 years ago was still a little more forbidden to talk about, and the big D, which still is very difficult for people to talk about, then who would do this for my students? I'm in a perfect position to incorporate this into my classes and to make this yet another teachable moment. So we all knew right from the beginning about the diagnosis, and we got updates, and Diane talked about it very openly to each one of us in the family and friends. So I'm going to read a section, starts on page 50 of Living Consciously, Dying Gracefully, called Planning Her Death, which she did, and I think we can all take a few tips from her. My brother Bill and Diane spent a lot of time talking about what Diane wanted for her end of life. She wanted to die at home, but how exactly should her body be handled? Where should the visitation be? At home? At a mortuary? And if so, which mortuary? What type of celebration could honor her life? What would happen at it? Who would participate in it? Where would it be? By the end of June, Bill had written a 4-page single-spaced document that described what Diane wanted when she died. Given that no one knew exactly what would happen at the end, Diane agreed that the plan should be flexible. Together, they visited mortuaries until they found one who welcomed their unusual ideas about a home vigil and gave them information to help them plan. The mortician said it was one of the few times a person with a terminal diagnosis had interviewed him. He agreed to work with Bill and Diane in whatever way they wished. He was impressed with the active role that Diane took in the preparations. He said that most people leave the arrangements to the family, who then often don't know what to do and sometimes argue. After Diane decided on cremation, she wanted something special to hold her remains. So I describe a bit about how that played out. In the months leading up to her death, Diane spent time visualizing and organizing her life celebration. By the very act of planning it, Diane was able to continue her connections with those closest to her. As Bill explained, she drove the operation. She brought people to the house and asked them to participate. She had a lot of fun doing it. And I was one of the people when I was visiting her one time, she asked if I would read a poem that I had sent her, a Mary Oliver poem. Many of you probably know it, in Blackwater Woods. She loved that poem and wanted me to read it at her life celebration. And so she asked me in person, and we got to talk about her dying. She parceled out tasks to dozens of people who felt honored to be included. Later, a family member commented that Diane, quote, knew she was worthy of celebration, which sends a message that we all are, that we should claim a final tribute and design a unique crescendo for ourselves. When Diane asked her niece's husband, John Olseth, to sing a song at her memorial, he was so overcome that he volunteered to write one, especially for her. He played it for her 11 days before she died, and she was very moved by it. John learned how therapeutic writing a memorial song could be 4 months later when his brother died in a mountain biking accident. John wrote a song for David as part of his grieving process. The week before she died, Diane called a family meeting at her bed. For 2 hours, she talked about her life celebration. She had already delegated many of the tasks. Still, things like the program and decorations had to be done, as well as bookmarks that she wanted handed out to everyone. Loving nature as she did, Diane wanted her celebration to be outside. Sibley Park was an obvious choice. In a letter to her college friends, Diane explained that the park was, quote, where I've spent many hours walking and checking flowers, sledding with our children, checking the river, and last fall, I organized a walk there for cancer and its relationship to the environment. I told Bill this morning as we discussed my life celebration that it sounded like something I would like to attend. And it was indeed a fabulous life celebration at the park where she and Bill had spent so much time. So I think it was partly luck that everything worked out so beautifully and gracefully around Diane's dying process, but partly it was a result of her being so intentional and deciding early on to have conversations with all of the key players in her life. And so one of the questions today that we would like to consider is, how do you have these conversations with the important people in your life? How do you bring it up? Where do you have this conversation? On a walk, just spontaneously? Do you invite everybody to come and you say, this is what I want to talk to you about, and you sit them down and you do it in a more focused and intentional way? Do you hope that over Thanksgiving, at the Thanksgiving table, that somehow the topic of death will just spontaneously arise and you'll have your opening then? So yeah, we'd like to talk about that more. And one of the best ways to get practice in talking about death are death cafes. And we would like to turn it over to Ruth Deborah to tell you a little more about her experience with death cafes.
Well, these days, it's really easy to find a death cafe because most of them now are still being done virtually. So if you go to the website, I think it's deathcafe.org or deathcafe.com, you can find it. It is a great honor to me to be facilitating one in Southern California. And we have people that have attended from Hungary and Boston and plenty of spaces in between. It's a safe place. It's not the kind of conversation that people have easily, but it is a safe place to talk about death and dying, anything you want to talk about it. Death cafes don't have a topic per se, except for the subject of death and dying. And it's an unstructured conversation with a facilitator to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak. But there's no no topic that they say, well, today we're going to discuss ABC, and that doesn't happen. But it is really, it's a great opening for people to be able to learn how to talk about it a little bit, to get some information if they want information, and to also make it easier for you when you want to talk to your family members or your partner or your best friends about your own death or their death or anything having to do with death. I mean, I've been able to talk to my daughter about things quite a bit and about what I wanted in my, as far as life support and everything. Now, I loved what Nancy and Becky said about the home vigil, but I don't know with COVID whether that's still allowed to happen. It may be different in state by state. So that would take a little research if you're interested in doing that to see if somebody does die of COVID, what can be done, because I'm sure it's changed. But you'd be surprised once you start talking, it gets easier each time. It really, really does. And there are conversations that you really need to have. Do you want life support? Do you want a funeral? Do you want a celebration of life? The only total tradition with in-person death cafes is that there's always cake and some other kind of refreshments. So that is very much part of the culture, that you feed people. And I think that brings people closer. Back to Nancy and Becky.
Thank you, Rose. We are open to questions. If Nev, if you want to see what people are interested in discussing.
Sure, I'm going to turn off the recording so that we don't have folks question, but we will have those questions in the chat if somebody wants to keep track of those.